I'm here tonight to speak to you from my perspective as a local paediatrician about some of the challenges we face. But first, a disclaimer: the views I present are entirely my own and in no way representative of my employer, Taranaki District Health Board. I believe we do live in a paradise here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Taranaki is the jewel in the crown. We live in the wealthiest province in New Zealand. Our children should be thriving, but many of them are not. Many of them are being born into lives of disadvantage, and they're getting sick and dying at far greater rates than their wealthier counterparts. This is an injustice that we as New Zealanders should not be willing to tolerate. So what is child poverty? I'm speaking about children growing up in families with insufficient income or resources to enable them to thrive. But to understand poverty, we first have to understand wealth. And this is a graph of the distribution of New Zealand's wealth by household. And the richest 10% of New Zealanders own, this is 50%, actually the latest figures are 60% of the wealth in New Zealand. And the poorest 50%, that's half of all New Zealanders, own less than 5% of the wealth. And as you can see from these figures below here, this is median, the middle figure. So half the Māori population own less, households own less than 23,000, and for Pacifica, families less than 12,000. So they have a fraction of the wealth of Europeans. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is that this inequality has occurred over the course of my life. And this is a graph showing incomes in New Zealand for the last 30 years. And as you can see from here, this blue line is down the bottom is the median, again, the middle. So for half of New Zealanders, their incomes have barely changed in the last 30 years. For the richest 10%, the yellow line, their incomes have almost doubled. And for the wealthiest 1%, their incomes have more than doubled. There are many different ways of measuring poverty, measuring child poverty, but one of the commonest and internationally accepted ones is an income measure based on 60% below the median household income after housing costs. And based on this figure, this is taken from 2015 data. Actually, the latest figures for income poverty for children in New Zealand are closer to 30%, about 29% of children living in income poverty. Another measure is material deprivation. So that's children going without the basic things they need, like food, clothing, and shoes. And if you combine these two measures, material deprivation and income poverty, you get the hard end of poverty, severe poverty. And it's estimated about 10% of New Zealand children are living in that severe poverty. And we do have figures for Taranaki, because the TSB Trust commissioned some work from the Office of the Children's Commissioner in 2015. The figures they came up with were over 20% of children in Taranaki are living in income poverty, and that equates to about 6,000 children. Over 4,000 children are experiencing material deprivation, and at that hard end of poverty is about 2,500 children. Another way of measuring poverty is to look at geographical areas of deprivation. This is taken from census data, and the figures are very similar. So over 4,500 children in Taranaki living in deprivation areas 9 and 10. And it would be no surprise to any of you working with these children that we know exactly where they are. So over a third of those children are in Waitara, just under a third right here in New Plymouth, concentrated in Marfell and Motoroa, and then another third of them living around the coast in our southern Taranaki communities. Housing is at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, And there is good evidence for improving housing, for improving people's health, and that it's cost effective to do so. For any of you that are sceptical about whether poverty exists in Taranaki, this is an example of rental accommodation here in New Plymouth. I took these photos myself of a house not far from here. And as you can see, there is rot in the window frame extending right through the window. There's panes of glass missing, and these tricycles indicate there have been small children living in this home. So what do we see in health? We see sick children, particularly those with respiratory illnesses and skin infections, and disproportionately Māori and Pacific Island children. It's estimated in New Zealand that we're losing about 40 or 50 babies a year from poverty-related conditions before their first birthday. And we have about 40,000 poverty-related hospital admissions for children per year in New Zealand. There's a strong association between poverty and many of the conditions we see. And this graph just shows that if you live in the poorest area, that deprivation 10, you're almost 3 times more likely to die before your 24th birthday than if you live in the wealthiest area. And this is a graph of hospital admissions for serious bacterial infection over a 20-year period. And it looks something like a tidal wave, doesn't it? And this rise in the wave correlates directly with the economic reforms that occurred in the 1990s and lags only slightly behind the picture we see for child poverty. And these diseases, meningitis, rheumatic heart disease, TB, these are what we call third world diseases because they are related to poverty and overcrowding. And the graph on the right just shows you that the proportion of children in New Zealand living in poverty has doubled over a similar time period. So what are we going to do about this wicked problem? A complex issue with multiple causes. Well, the good news is that child poverty is not inevitable. It results from deliberate political decisions related to economic and social welfare policies. We know the things that underpin and support child well-being. And economics and neuroscience tell us that it is crucial to invest early in a child's life. This graph is taken from the work of Professor James Heckman, an American economist who won a Nobel Prize for his work in this area. And it just shows that the dollar returns on investment are exponential the earlier you invest in a child's life. I've superimposed this picture of neuronal connections just to emphasize that we also know that it's the first 3 years in a child's life that's critical for brain development. This is when the hard wiring of the brain occurs, and it is the experiences a child has in those early years that will determine whether it grows up to be a capable, contributing adult or not. This is where we should be investing to ensure that supportive, nurturing relationships occur and that our tamariki have the best chance in life. Tui ki te rangi, tui ki te whenua, tui ki te nākau, ko te mehe nui, ko te aroha, ti hei mauri ora. There will be an opportunity, as Bryan said, for you to ask questions in the latter half of this meeting, but if you feel more comfortable to text them, that is the text number here. Whoops, sorry. And these are just a couple of quotes that are from children living in poverty, just describing the experience from their point of view. Thank you.